is making a comeback.
Presumptive Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden has dominated the polls for most of 2020, and that's made the Trump base more than a bit jittery. But just this week, the hefty lead enjoyed by the former vice president began to dissolve. Presidential poll numbers, even big ones, can radically change in a New York minute. Just ask Michael Dukakis. More on Mr. Mike later, but first, a moment to assess the current situation. A couple of months ago, the so-called basket of deplorables, we'll call them BODs, fell back on the old, well, the polls got it wrong the last time, didn't they? But the negative numbers for President Donald Trump have been so widespread and persistent, even the faithful needed some reassurance. Well, here it is. Without a doubt, it will be a rocky road to November 3rd, but just like the ice cream, Mr. Biden's lead is likely to melt as summer turns to fall. Until then, the BODs will need to buck up, hang on, and hold tight. For while the journey may be strewn with obstacles, victory is assured for the man in the Oval Office. You heard that right. Victory is assured. And how can this be said with such certitude? Here are 3 reasons. Number 1, the pendulum effect. The double sucker punch of COVID-19 and civil unrest ginned up by the Marxist-leading Black Lives Matter has walloped the president. But Mr. Trump is nothing if not resilient, much like the U.S. economy. Both are bound to bounce back despite multiple attempts by the Democrats to do everything in their power to frighten the American people. From falsely spiking the COVID numbers to giving free rein to anarchists, the truth has a way of emerging despite the scare tactics. During this season of unrest, Mr. Biden has taken up with those on the hard left, and this will be his Waterloo. Americans are stereotypically fiercely independent and tend to be a moderate lot. Over 2 decades, Gallup has consistently reported that somewhere between 35 and 38% of the American electorate consider themselves moderate. But the former vice president has swung so far to the progressives, his pendulum has swayed past the American people. Bit by bit, Biden is removing himself from the moderate wing of his party, and this will not serve him well as the election draws nigh. Reason 2, the silent majority effect. If you thought there was a backlash of the silent majority in 2016, just hang on to your hat. Speak up at your own risk may be the order of the day, but this too has a way of rubbing Americans raw. It makes for a sore that festers and will eventually ooze out at the voting booth. While most Americans don't want to engage in confrontation, they're not likely to let that stop them from exercising their franchise on Election Day. The crazies running rampant in the streets only serve to firm up the resolve of this silent majority. A recent Monmouth poll studied what they called the secret voter. So at least some folks are waking up to the fact that there are plenty of Americans in the vast open spaces of America who keep their heads down, keep their mouths shut, but will not relinquish their vote to someone who has plans to bring the United States to its knees. In and around those amber waves of grain are the people who plant it, grow it, harvest it, and have had enough of the current madness. This, folks, is why voting booths come with curtains, because it's a private decision. This brings us to our third, final, and perhaps most significant reason for the BOD to be confident about the election: the Electoral College. Only a few pollsters got it right in 2016, and Helmut Norpoth, a political science professor, was among them. Norpoth developed something called the primary model, a presidential election forecast formula. There must be something to it because he's been dead on for about 25 of the 27 elections. Anyway, this time the good professor predicts 362 electors for President Trump. And even Ellen's Tim Donner projects 350 electoral votes for Trump. How can this be? The large urban centers of America, home to the behemoth members of the Fourth Estate, carry the loudest microphones. So from the New York Times to the LA Times, everyone is basically on the same page. Unfortunately, there is a little territory between the proverbial sea to shining sea, and it's filled to the brim with those in the BODs. And all of these places bring electors with them to the party. It's difficult for some to remember, but our republic is based on 50 state elections that, when put together, make for a national election. The brilliance here is that not only it protects the smaller states, but 50 smaller elections are a lot harder to rig than one big one. This is why calls that Trump will rig the election are utter nonsense. Look, The road to losing the presidency is littered with early frontrunners. Thomas Dewey in 1948, Richard Nixon in 60, James Earl Carter in 1980, George H.W. Bush in 92, John Kerry in 2004. But perhaps the starkest case of an early frontrunner who lost came in 1988. At the end of July, post-convention, Michael Dukakis had a lead of 17 points over Bush the father. Today, most Americans under the age of 30 would ask, Mike who? And that, dear deplorables, is precisely the point. And that's my viewpoint for today.
Truth is making a comeback.